There was a time, not too long ago, when a major airline would happily sell you an international flight for €1, entirely banking on the fact that once they trapped you in a metal tube at 30,000 feet, you would get bored enough to buy a scratch card, thirsty enough to buy an overpriced bottle of water, and hungry enough to buy a lukewarm panini. This was the golden rule of Ryanair's pricing algorithm for years. Load factor active, yield passive. In plain English, this meant the airline would drop ticket prices to absolute rock bottom, sometimes literally pennies, just to ensure that a plane took off at 100% capacity. They hated flying empty seats. They knew that a full plane of bargain hunters would inevitably generate revenue through in-flight purchases and ancillary fees. It was a brilliant, disruptive, and wildly successful business model that crowned Ryanair the undisputed budget king of European skies. But if you've tried to book a summer holiday recently, you have probably noticed something alarming. The legendary €9.99 fare is dead, and it is never coming back. Ryanair's days as the budget king are officially over. This is not just because of inflation or temporary supply chain hiccups. The entire macroeconomic, regulatory, and environmental ecosystem that allowed ultra-low-cost aviation to exist has permanently collapsed. Today, we are going to look at exactly how European legislation, algorithmic shifts, and a war on third-party websites have grounded the era of flying across a continent for the price of a cup of coffee. Let us start with the very foundation of the budget airline illusion, the base fare. Ryanair's entire marketing strategy relies on advertising a €20 ticket, fully knowing that the average passenger will likely pay €50 to €70 after adding a cabin bag and selecting a seat. For years, this was just accepted as the annoying but necessary trade-off for cheap travel. But consumer protection agencies across Europe have had enough, and they are increasingly viewing this business model not as a clever unbundling of services, but as deceptive drip pricing. This regulatory crackdown is actively escalating, and it threatens to destroy the psychological illusion of the ultra-cheap ticket. In May of 2024, Spain's Ministry of Consumer Affairs dropped a massive hammer on the budget airline industry. They issued a historic €150 million fine distributed among several budget airlines, including Ryanair, Vueling, EasyJet, and Volotea, citing abusive practices. What exactly were these abusive practices? The Spanish government targeted the very core of the low-cost model. They fined the airlines for charging passengers for standard cabin luggage. They fined them for charging fees to select seats next to dependent children or disabled passengers. They even fined them for prohibiting cash payments at the airport. This is a monumental shift in how governments treat airlines. If European Union courts uphold these rulings and decide to ban fees for standard carry-on bags across the entire bloc, Ryanair will be forced to roll the cost of that luggage back into the base fare. The advertised budget price will instantly jump. You will no longer see a €20 flight. You will see a €50 flight. The airline might make the exact same amount of money in the end, but the psychological hook that made Ryanair the budget king will be outlawed. But consumer protection laws are just a drop in the bucket compared to the massive financial tidal wave approaching the aviation industry. The green premium. Aviation is a primary target for European climate goals, and for good reason. The era of cheap flights was heavily subsidized by a glaring lack of taxation on aviation fuel and carbon emissions. Airlines were essentially allowed to pollute for free, keeping operating costs artificially low. The European Union is now forcing airlines to pay for their pollution, and the ultra-low-cost model is taking a direct, devastating hit. Under the EU emissions trading system, airlines historically received a large portion of their carbon allowances for free. This was a massive financial shield, but the EU is phasing out these free allowances entirely by 2026. This is a massive problem for Ryanair because, as Europe's largest airline by passenger numbers, it is also one of Europe's top corporate carbon emitters. Every ton of carbon they emit will soon have to be paid for at market rates, and those costs will be passed directly on to the consumer. Furthermore, the European Union has introduced the ReFuelEU aviation rules. This legislation mandates that fuel suppliers must blend a minimum of 2% sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, into their kerosene by 2025. That mandate rises to 6% by 2030 and a staggering 70% by 2050. Sustainable aviation fuel is incredible technology, but it comes with a massive catch. Currently, SAF costs 3 to 5 times more than traditional jet fuel. Fuel is already one of the largest operating expenses for any airline. When you force an airline to use fuel that is up to 5 times more expensive, the math behind a €10 ticket completely disintegrates. Even Ryanair's CEO, Michael O'Leary, has explicitly cited the rising cost of carbon credits and the future costs of sustainable aviation fuel as the primary reasons why the ultra-low fare is mathematically impossible to sustain. The green transition is necessary for the planet, but it is the final nail in the coffin for dirt-cheap air travel. While Ryanair battles regulators and environmental mandates, they are also fighting a massive war on the digital front against online travel agencies. For years, travelers found Ryanair's cheapest flights by using aggregators and third-party booking sites like Kiwi, Booking.com, and Kayak. These sites would scrape Ryanair's pricing data and display it side by side with competitors, allowing consumers to easily find the absolute lowest price. Ryanair historically dominated these platforms, winning the Budget King title by consistently ranking #1 for the cheapest fare. But recently, Ryanair launched an aggressive legal and technological war against these sites. They labeled them as pirates, accusing them of scraping data without permission and adding hidden markups to the fares. In December of 2023, Ryanair's aggressive screen scraping blocks and legal threats culminated in several major online travel agencies suddenly dropping Ryanair flights from their platforms entirely. Ryanair claims this crusade is to protect consumers from third-party markups, but the reality of their strategy is much deeper. By removing themselves from price comparison engines, Ryanair loses the massive volume of traffic that comes from people simply searching for the cheapest way to get from point A to point B. In fact, to compensate for the sudden drop in traffic from these sites in early 2024, Ryanair actually had to temporarily lower some fares just to stimulate direct bookings. But their long-term goal is total ecosystem control. Ryanair wants to force every single passenger to go directly to Ryanair.com or use their mobile app. Why? Because when you book directly, they control the entire digital environment. They can aggressively push high-margin ancillaries that third-party sites often strip away. They want to sell you the hotel, the car rental, and the travel insurance. They are transitioning from being just a cheap airline to being a closed-loop travel retailer. But by pulling out of the aggregator ecosystem, they are voluntarily stepping down from the podium where they used to proudly wear the crown of the cheapest option on the internet. This brings us to a quiet, but profound, shift in Ryanair's internal algorithmic strategy. We talked earlier about their old philosophy: load factor active, yield passive. Fill the plane at any cost, even if tickets sell for €1. Today, that philosophy has changed. Post-COVID revenge travel taught Ryanair a very valuable lesson. Consumers are actually willing to pay more. People were so desperate to travel after the lockdowns that they absorbed massive price hikes without blinking. Ryanair's pricing algorithms learned from this behavior. Instead of dumping last-minute inventory for pennies just to hit a 99% load factor, the algorithm is now much more comfortable letting average fares rise. In fiscal year 2024, Ryanair's average fares went up by 21%. The algorithm has realized that flying a plane at 93 or 94% capacity with higher-paying passengers yields significantly better overall profit margins than flying a plane at 100% capacity filled with people who only paid €10. Make no mistake, Ryanair still maintains industry-leading load factors, averaging 94%. They still hate flying empty seats, but the desperation to fill that last middle seat in the back row by practically giving it away is gone. They have shifted from a strategy of maximum volume to a strategy of maximum revenue per flight. And as Ryanair evolves, so does the competition, which leads to the final reason their unique identity is fading. The legacy carriers have learned how to play the game. If you rewind to the early 2000s, the contrast between a traditional airline like British Airways and a budget disruptor like Ryanair was night and day. Traditional airlines offered free checked bags, free meals, and spacious seating, but charged a premium. Ryanair offered nothing, but charged almost nothing. Today, that gap has completely blurred. Traditional, expensive airlines have successfully copied the Ryanair model. The Lufthansa Group now uses Eurowings to compete on budget routes. Air France-KLM uses Transavia. The parent company of British Airways and Iberia uses Vueling and Level. Furthermore, almost all legacy carriers now utilize basic economy fares on their short-haul European routes. If you book a cheap ticket on British Airways today, you are getting the exact same experience you get on Ryanair. No checked bags, no seat selection, and no free food. Because legacy carriers now mimic Ryanair's unbundled pricing, Ryanair is no longer a unique disruptor in the market. They are simply the largest player in what has become a completely standardized European aviation model. When you combine all of these factors, the reality becomes undeniable. The era of the budget king is over because the specific historical window that allowed it to exist has slammed shut. Ryanair's legendary cheap fares were propped up by 5 distinct pillars. First, carbon emissions were free and unregulated. Second, ancillary fee structures and drip pricing were ignored by consumer protection agencies. Third, Boeing aircraft deliveries were cheap, abundant, and on time. Fourth, the global economy was experiencing rock-bottom interest rates and cheap jet fuel. And fifth, they operated with a lack of unionized labor. Every single one of those pillars has now collapsed. Carbon is being taxed, and expensive sustainable fuel is being mandated. Governments are fining airlines millions for charging for carry-on bags. Boeing is facing massive production delays, forcing airlines to fly older, less efficient planes. Fuel and interest rates have surged, and Ryanair's pilots and cabin crew have successfully unionized across Europe, demanding and receiving better pay and working conditions. If you found this deep dive into the aviation industry fascinating, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more. Ryanair remains a highly efficient, brilliantly run, and relatively affordable airline. They will continue to dominate European airspace, and they will continue to be the go-to choice for millions of travelers. But the magic trick is over. The days of flying across a continent for less than the cost of your taxi to the airport are permanently grounded. The budget king is dead, replaced by a highly calculated, heavily regulated, and significantly more expensive reality.